Jean-Baptiste VIALE, Senior Lecturer in Science and Techniques for Architecture at the École Nationale Supérieure d'Architecture de Clermont-Ferrand. And I would like to thank all of those who have allowed for this conference to happen. So my major focus will be on architecture, as architecture is what I've discovered for me as a passion and which I studied. To start off, our first goal, the first thing I wanted to mention was that we talk a lot about facades in architecture, about different building shapes. And I had also seen that the same notions are approximately in every scientific field the same. But at some point, during my studies, I was together with a friend of mine who was studying philosophy. So we were taking the car, driving off to uni, and at the same time, I was just seeing the streets driving by. I was seeing the streets flying, gazing out of the window, and sensed that there is a rhythm in this architecture. So before we go further into detail, what do we talk about when we talk about rhythm? Rhythm is kind of a word that has a very broad meaning. So when we talk about rhythm, it's derived from the Greek term rheo, which means to flow, to improvise, and it also stems from rhythmos, which is a particular way of flowing or a particular order in movement. So the rhythm is a phenomenon, can also be interpreted as, for instance, the different seasons we have in a year. But this is not something we necessarily feel. Of course, you can feel that it's getting warmer or colder, but that's not something that you can really feel firsthand. But if you listen to music, for instance, you listen to the flow of music, to the rhythm, and this is where you connect immediately. This is something that you can feel right away. So there are two components. So on the one hand side, the periodicity, and then the structure. So we have a spatial dimension and a time dimension. And in that, these events are spatially segmented. Paul Fries has also worked on this issue or on this topic of rhythm. We will only work on what we feel, not on what we think, because we are not in the direct experience in this manner. And we will work on only periodic phenomenons, because spatial elements present themselves immediately to us. For instance, if I see the notes of the scoreboard, I can see it immediately and recognize it. So in order to do so, he'll base himself on a quote of Bergson, who says, when the regular oscillations of the pendulum invite us to sleep, is it the last sound heard, the last movement perceived that produces this effect? We must therefore admit that the sounds were composed of each other and acted not by the quantity as quantity, but by the quality that their quantity presented, that is to say, by the rhythmic organization of their whole. So, briefly speaking, that means he asks himself, why am I waking up when my alarm goes off? Why? It's almost like it's saying, is my alarm making or my alarm clock making tick-tock or tack-tick. I mean, this sounds a bit absurd, but I'll come back to that later. So we can observe that rhythmic groups, and Fries has made a number of different experiences with this rhythmic pulsions, and these groups appear between 0.1 and 2 seconds. So that means, for instance, something that is very isochronous, like a metronome, we can somehow group the different sounds that we can perceive. So there is an extension of the intervals between two groups. And that means that most of the time, the first element, the first phenomenon, is the one that we perceive as the most important one. Je l'entends plus. Then, if we have an isochronic pulse, if we force that pulse and we listen to that pendulum, we will have a... Okay. That somehow is a problem for me. That's an issue. That's why I thought to myself I was going to explore this issue. So if I have something that is only temporary, or which is only in the periodic realm, I have to, at some point, it means that the eternal repetition is an illusion. This is more, rather, it would be a succession of very similar things. So the first tree distinguishes from the second tree, from the third tree, but is still similar. But there is a differentiation between the trees. Are we talking about differences that immediately appear? Are these even numbers or odd numbers or prime numbers? And these differences, which are induced by the time, will then lead to the... Is that the spatial dimension? So, to make a long story short, I was talking about this car ride to the uni, and I was seeing the building flying by and the trees. Actually, what I'm doing there is grouping different rhythms. So I've done several experiences on this topic. I wouldn't be able to present them, all of them today, but I would focus on just the example of walking. And I have a hypothesis about this. So there are processes within perceptual organization that enable us to make visual groupings. So, and the quality of these groupings can be a source of direct sensory emotion in our visual apprehension of the world. So, in order to make this experience, I kidnapped some students and asked them to say what they thought about the screenings that I was showing them. So these are just 3-second long screenings. And the question was, what are the impressions you gather from these 3 seconds? Then the idea behind it, you look at it for 3 seconds, and then they list up what they have for impressions, and we just write it down. Now, the idea is that actually all the slides that have been shown are, as you can see, broken down in those 4 different categories. For instance, the group 1 consists of facades with a strongly isochronous rhythm, the group 2 of facades encouraging grouping of elements, as you can see, and the group 3 rhythmic marking of facade with a little structure, and finally group 4 buildings where there is no perception of the rhythm possible. The sequence of this slide is designed to avoid comparisons between similar slides as far as possible. To make sure that we have a double-blind test, we have to make sure that they compare the least possible. Because if we have a pattern that can be recognized, we would be talking about aesthetics at this point, not about rhythm. So what we are going to do then is that we are going to categorize all the different assertions relative to your perception as to how you perceive this as a rhythm. So we have architectural shapes and ambiances, then sensations, feelings of the ambience and the aesthetic value, and lastly, the indices which are identified during the visual input. So, for instance, for the Exhibit 1, D14, there is a feeling of being a bit, how to say, like, so, other example. So the first one is a picture. This is the same building, but basically we say the first one has offices in it, and the second one has flats. So this impressive facade on the first picture that also sometimes can seem intimidating for some of the participants, and the other one. So how do we perceive and how do we interpret this rhythm? So perception and verbalization do not always go hand in hand. Perceived periodicity in line with an initial visual tactile aesthetic, and then we can see a direct correlation between that first emotion and the final aesthetic judgment made by the subject. And then we'll try to justify, having the background in mind, a cultural background, why we think that this and that facade is somehow intimidating or somehow is pleasant to look at. Then the rhythmic form allows for grasping the organization of the whole at a glance and to relate the units to the whole without having to add up the perceptual sum of each unit. Now, as for rhythmic composition, we can see that the feelings start to change with the isochronicity of the rhythm. And often, in contrast to that, there is a smooth rhythm which people perceive as less severe. So towards a rhythmic reading of a place, of an alley. So it's a direct sensory emotion, and it's also an emotion that is a synthesis of different senses that we have as a result of our input. So, approaching the subjectivity of architectural or landscape spaces through the rhythmic dimension of the components means integrating an affective dimension through the subject's motor intention. So, any reading of form is in a temporal frame which is embedded in the same form, and at the same time there is a reciprocity in, wow. So to conclude, I'd say the rhythm that slips between each tree as we stroll along the wooded lanes is a dance of the eye that engages all our senses and our being. I tried my best.